What is the truth? It seems like every day that question gets harder for our society to answer. The objective truths we've relied on for thousands of years to inform our decisions and live our lives have recently been questioned into obscurity. We are now facing the consequences. Questions like what is a woman and is sex biological may seem innocuous, but the real-world implications have been devastating. In 2022, vulnerable and impressionable children are being chemically castrated and surgically mutilated in the name of tolerance and gender-affirming care. In some cases, parents who object to this radical ideology are being punished by the law. Now more than ever, our society is confused. Thankfully, in the midst of this confusion, there are several voices who are waking people up to the reality of the situation and fighting for objective truth. One of those voices is Matt Walsh. He is bringing clarity back to the public with his new documentary, What is a Woman? I recently traveled to UC Berkeley to catch a screening of this new documentary to see what the hype was all about. Following the screening, I had the privilege of speaking with Matt about the film and his ongoing fight for the truth. This is that interview. Matt, your documentary, What is a Woman, is going viral. It's very eye-opening, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to sit down with us and to talk a little bit more about it. The first question I want to ask is, what was your favorite part of filming this documentary?
It's hard to even say a favorite, because even the parts that you kind of enjoy, there was an element to it that made it sort of sad and disturbing. So I would say going to Africa was, just an experience that I'll probably never duplicate in my life. And not just like, I might visit the continent again, but going there and being in a position to actually introduce these kinds of ideas to people that have no framework for them whatsoever, just from kind of an anthropological perspective, was very, very interesting. So I'd say that was the favorite part. But it was also quite just sad to see how our culture is viewed, elsewhere in the world, and they view it accurately as sort of a, insane mess.
That part of the film really was eye-opening for me. You go into this culture, this place that isn't, quote unquote, as advanced as we are, but for some reason, they still have a better grasp of identity and of gender roles. Why do you think that is? Have we advanced too much? Have we gotten too progressive?
I mean, yeah, you could call it progressive. It's progressive in the same, I think of American progressivism as progress in the same way that cancer progresses, like it eats away and destroys. And so we certainly have that problem here more than they have in other parts of the world. But also, gender ideology itself is a Western invention that was invented in our, not just in the United States, but in the West. And it has been exported, to other parts of the world, but hasn't made it to some of these parts that are more insulated, perhaps because they don't have as much technology. But I also think they have other built-in defenses, like just their society is built around, to use the term that people would use in our country, it's a very gendered society, like the Maasai tribe. You're a man or you're a woman, and depending on if you're a man or a woman, it determines what you do, what your role is. And so they don't spend a lot of time like sort of navel gazing and wondering about their gender. They just live it every day. And it's almost, that's why when I first asked them the question, like, what's a woman? They were confused by the question, not because they couldn't answer, but because it was so obvious that they couldn't understand why I'd even ask in the first place, because they just have a totally different framework.
I think the success of this film, really points to the hunger that people are having for clarity and just acknowledgement of objective truth and reality. But why is that? Why is there a market for that? How have we gotten to the point where objective truth has been denied, and we've just done nothing about it? How did this happen in our sleep? Did this happen?
No, it seems like it happened in our sleep, because at least when it comes to the gender stuff, I think for a lot of people, you have the perception that everything was kind of normal, and then we woke up one day 5 years ago or 6, 7 years ago, whatever it was, and Bruce Jenner's Caitlyn Jenner, and suddenly men can be women and women can be men. It seems like it was overnight, but as we try to flesh out in the film, this was a process that took, certainly you could trace it back decades. You could even go back farther than that if you want. It kind of depends on where you want to start. But it was, it infiltrated society through institutions, kind of out of sight for a lot of people, until one day, in effect, it sort of exploded onto the mainstream. But it was really, this is the result of a long, considered and deliberate process.
One quote that sticks with me, especially when I think about these subjects, the left's radical gender ideology, is from John Stuart Mill. It says, "The only thing for the necessity of the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." And as a Catholic, I think, and I know you're a Catholic, I think of the church's role in doing nothing, or maybe our religious institutions, more broadly speaking, doing nothing. How much of the blame should we be putting on our religious institutions on letting this ideology take such a strong foothold in our society? And what role do you think they have in taking it back and drawing the line and reclaiming our culture?
As a Catholic myself, I'd give the Christian Church 100% of the blame for completely failing in its own duty and responsibility to protect our culture from this kind of thing, and to be a light of truth and clarity and moral decency. And I think it's just been an abject, total failure and abdication of their responsibilities. And there are exceptions. I mean, as a Catholic, of course, I know that there are a lot of really good priests out there. I think especially the younger, even now I'm encouraged by some of the younger kind of crop of priests tend to be, to my view, much firmer, I guess we would say more conservative than the older kind of boomer priests. So there are some hopeful trends, but generally speaking, I think if you are a Catholic, then you believe that the Catholic Church plays an essential, pivotal role in the culture. And so if our culture is sliding into oblivion, then you can't deny the failure on the part of the church.
Couldn't agree more. I want to get your reaction while we're here in San Francisco of Mayor Breed's new guaranteed income program that's giving up to $1,200 for up to 18 months for low-income transgenders in the city. And the claim, they say, is that the transgenders here are marginalized, I guess, at a higher rate than other groups. And, it's confusing to me. Are we really supposed to believe that in San Francisco, one of the most progressive, LGBTQ-friendly cities in the country, that they are being marginalized at a higher rate than other groups? Or is there something else that we're missing?
Yeah, no, it's the unfalsifiable nature of the claims that are made about systemic, whether there's transphobia or systemic racism or whatever. It becomes unfalsifiable because what you find out is that no matter what happens, like there's nothing that can happen that will make the left say, okay, yeah, you know what, it's actually fine. Transphobia, we've solved transphobia. It's not that much of a problem anymore. Or systemic racism isn't that much of a problem anymore. No matter what happens, they will tell you that it's just as bad as it's ever been. It's like systemic racism. It's according to them, it's as bad as it was like during the Civil War now, even after we had a black president. So what that tells us is that it's an unfalsifiable theory, and they're going to cling to it, the narrative, no matter what happens. And although I am encouraged by the fact that in San Francisco, you can fill in whatever gender you want, and be given the income, but you have to be a San Francisco resident. So I'm wondering if I could say that my gender is San Francisco resident, right, they'll give me the income.
Well, I mean, I read a report this morning that said there was a 3,000% increase in self-identified trans in San Francisco. I don't know if there's any correlation.
Let's not get conspiratorial.
Who knows?
Come on.
Who knows? Another thing I want to get your reaction on, or maybe just your thoughts on, is how this left-wing gender ideology is affecting our young boys. I think obviously this film touches on the young girls and the women in our country, but I think now in our society, young men are at a crisis point in their identity, in their faith, in their morality. Sperm counts are at the lowest they've ever been. Church membership among men is down 20% in the last 20 years. How do young men fit into this picture, and how are they being affected by this left-wing radical gender ideology?
Well, yeah, there's a war on masculinity, and it's not all that surprising that when the message from the culture is that men are, toxic, masculinity is a toxic thing that you have to reject, and all we get is this kind of denigration and the demonization and scapegoating of men, and then you find a whole bunch of boys who say, I don't think I want to be a boy anymore. I don't think that also is not a coincidence. It is also interesting that when it comes to the transgender phenomenon, certainly for right now, for adolescents who fall into it, the vast majority are girls. But it seems like, I don't have the numbers for this, but just based anecdotally on the younger children who are presented as transgender. When you hear about a young 5-year-old who's being paraded around as the next child trans hero, they're almost always boys. So it seems like if we're hearing about a 6-year-old trans person, trans child, which doesn't really exist, it's most likely going to be a boy. 14-year-old trans child, most likely a girl, which is an interesting phenomenon too. I'm not exactly sure how to explain that all the way, but it is interesting.
How important is the language that we use around the gender ideology? I personally try to refrain from using the word trans and say that it's a man pretending to be a woman or the other way around. Is that something you think is effective in not acknowledging and not using?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because you want people to understand what you're talking about. So that's why it can be easy to lapse into using some of these terms. I mean, even the term, just forget about trans, the term gender itself, really we shouldn't be using it, because gender as the idea that a person has a gender is an invention of the gender ideologues. It's gender and gender identity go hand in hand. The same people who came up with gender identity came up with the idea that people have a gender, when really people don't have a gender, people have a sex. So we shouldn't even be talking about gender, but it's just like, it's easy to lapse into it, and it kind of, if you're not being precise in your language, and also just because, again, you want people to understand what you're talking about. But I do think we need to be careful about that and start thinking a lot more about the words that we're using, and are we surrendering the argument before we can even make it,
right? Just
based purely on the language that we've chosen to use.
Who are the people that are benefiting most from this movement?
Yeah, I think every institution is finding a way to exploit and manipulate and profit off of this in some way. But it's easy to see how in the medical, the pharmaceutical industry, this is worth billions of dollars to them. The plastic surgeons, the endocrinologists who have now gotten into the hormone game. There are endocrinology clinics that used to be endocrinology clinics, and now all they do is give out hormone treatments. So, yeah, I think all of these groups have stood to gain money-wise quite a bit, and they are.
Something that I found when I was reporting on the child drag shows throughout the country, but more specifically in Texas, is I would record this footage of children in bars, putting dollar bills in grown man's underwear. And the responses I got was, isn't this already illegal? Why are children already allowed in bars? And I feel like I've seen similar comments about your film, that isn't it already illegal to give hormone blockers to 6, 7, 8-year-olds? Isn't it already illegal to do surgery on these adolescents? Are there actual laws on the books that are preventing this? And if so, how are they getting away with it?
Well, when it comes to the gender transitions for minors, there are, we are working on passing a law in Tennessee. There are a couple other states that have passed laws. Some of those are now hung up in the courts. So there are a few states where the laws are on the books, but most states they're not. And the reason why in many cases there's no law there is exactly the problem you're talking about, that people just assume that it's already illegal. And but it's not, and bringing a child to, we're also working on a law in Tennessee. There's going to be a law that's passed that makes that illegal as well, to bring a child to a drag show. It should already be illegal, and if you interpret the laws that are on the books correctly, then they would be. Like, this is sexual abuse, and sexual abuse of a child is already illegal, but they're not being applied that way, which is why separate law, they shouldn't need to be passed, but separate laws do need to be passed. But in order to get a movement towards these laws being passed, you need people to understand that this is happening, that it is being allowed to happen, and that it is a problem. So you got to raise that awareness. And once you do, then most people, intuitively understand why this stuff is horrifically evil.
Yeah, no, you talked about some of the laws that you're trying to pass. A lot of the detransitioners that I talk to almost every time talk about how their statute of limitations has passed, and they're unable to seek, any type of legal retribution from these surgeons for malpractice or for counseling them in the wrong direction. Are you aware of any efforts to establish statutes of limitations specifically for gender?
Yeah, Tennessee. Surgeries? That's what we're doing in Tennessee. Okay. That's part of the law, is allowing children who are mutilated to sue their medical providers and their parents too, if their parents played a role in this, for up to, I think the law says up to 20 years. But again, yeah, in most cases, these people who detransition are not able to seek retribution or compensation. The law doesn't allow it, so laws have to be changed to allow it.
Matt, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking to me more about your movie. It was incredible, and I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hey guys, thanks for watching this video. PragerU is a 501c3 organization. Help us keep our videos free by making a tax-deductible donation today. I appreciate your support.